A little boy stops Big Shaq on the street, not for an autograph, not for a picture, but for just $5. He says it's for his sick mother, but something isn't right. The fear in his eyes, the bruises on his arm, the way he refuses to take more than he asked for, it all points to a darker truth. Shaq follows, uncovering a home filled with secrets, silence, and control. A mother too afraid to ask for help, a boy trapped in a nightmare, and a man who won't let them go. Shaq has two choices: walk away, or change their lives forever. This isn't just about $5. It's about a fight that can't be won with fists. Before we deep dive into this interesting story, subscribe to our channel and tell us where are you watching from. Share in the comments below. The sun hung high over the city, casting sharp shadows against towering buildings, their glass windows reflecting a golden glare. The streets bustled with life. Cars honked impatiently, hurried pedestrians weaved through the chaos, and the distant echo of a street performer's saxophone floated in the air. Among the sea of people, one man stood out, not just for his towering frame, but for his presence: Big Shaq. Despite being a legend, Shaq moved through the world with ease, never carrying himself like a man above others. He had seen fame, fortune, and the highs of life, yet he always stayed rooted. A simple walk to grab a coffee often turned into a meet and greet, with fans eagerly stopping him for pictures, handshakes, or a quick chat. And Shaq, as always, never disappointed. But on this particular afternoon, something different caught his attention. At the corner of a busy intersection, near a rundown convenience store, stood a young boy, no older than 10. He had shaggy, unkempt hair, his oversized hoodie slipping off one shoulder, and a pair of sneakers so worn out that the soles looked like they could give in at any moment. He wasn't playing or running like most kids his age. He wasn't laughing. Instead, he stood motionless, his small hands clenched into fists at his sides, eyes scanning the passing crowd. Shaq, waiting for the light to turn, felt the boy's eyes on him. There was something about the way the kid looked at him, not the usual star-struck admiration or the excitement of recognizing a celebrity. This was different. It was hesitant, almost calculating, like he was debating something in his head. Then, just as Shaq was about to move on, the boy stepped forward. "Excuse me, sir." The boy's voice was barely above a whisper, but the urgency in his tone cut through the surrounding noise. Shaq looked down, his towering height making the boy crane his neck just to meet his gaze. "What's up, little man?" he asked, his voice warm, yet curious. The boy swallowed hard, shifting on his feet. His fingers dug into his hoodie pocket, then pulled out a crumpled $5 bill, creased, torn at the edges, barely holding together. He hesitated, as if unsure how to say the next part. "I need $5 more," he finally blurted out. "For my mom." Shaq raised an eyebrow. He had heard plenty of stories on the streets, from kids and adults alike, each one with a different plea, some real, some not. But something about the way this boy spoke, the way his small fingers gripped the torn bill so tightly, made Shaq pause. $5 for what?" Shaq asked, keeping his tone light but his gaze sharp. The boy hesitated again, shifting on his feet, his lips pressed together before he answered. "She's sick," he said. "She needs medicine." Shaq studied him for a moment. The kid wasn't looking at him like someone running a scam. He wasn't shifty, wasn't playing a role. His eyes were pleading yet guarded, as if he was used to being turned away. "You out here by yourself?" Shaq asked. The boy nodded. "Where's your mom now?" "At home." "A beat." She couldn't come." Shaq exhaled slowly, glancing around the street. The honking cars, the flashing billboards, the chatter of passers-by. It all faded for a second. All that remained was the boy, standing there with a mix of desperation and resilience. Shaq reached into his pocket, pulling out a crisp $20 bill. "Here," he said, holding it out. "This should help." But the boy didn't reach for it. Instead, his eyes flickered with something else. Guilt? Fear? Shaq couldn't quite place it. The boy hesitated, his hands tightening into fists. Then, in a quiet voice, he muttered, "I only need 5. That stopped Shaq in his tracks. Most kids in need wouldn't hesitate to take extra money, They would grab it and run, whether for good reasons or bad. But this kid, he was different. He wasn't trying to take more than he asked for. Shaq crouched down to meet the boy's eyes. "What's your name, little man?" "Elijah," the boy answered, still shifting nervously. "Elijah," Shaq repeated, his voice calm, steady. "Where do you live?" Elijah glanced away, staring at the ground. "Not far," he mumbled. Shaq could see it now. The hesitation, the fear. This wasn't just about a sick mom. There was something else here, something deeper, something unspoken. "You sure you don't want to take the 20? Shaq asked again. Elijah shook his head. "I just need 5, he insisted, his voice firmer this time. A strange weight settled in Shaq's chest. This wasn't just about money. The way Elijah stood there, the way his eyes darted around as if afraid someone might be watching, it set off alarm bells in Shaq's mind. Something wasn't right. Shaq glanced down the street, debating his next move. He wasn't about to walk away from this, not without knowing the full story. "Tell you what," Shaq said, standing back up. "Why don't I walk with you to the pharmacy? Make sure you get what you need." Elijah's reaction was immediate. His posture stiffened, his fingers twitching at his sides. "No, it's okay," he said quickly. I can go by myself." Shaq didn't like that answer. "Humor me," Shaq said, offering a small smile. "I need to stretch my legs anyway." Elijah swallowed hard, his eyes darting toward the crosswalk, as if weighing his options. Then, finally, he nodded, slowly, hesitantly. "Okay," he murmured. Shaq nodded, keeping his expression easy, but inside, his instincts were on high alert. He had been around too many people, seen too many situations, to ignore the red flags waving right in front of him. This wasn't just about $5. And as they started walking, Shaq knew one thing for certain. Whatever this boy was hiding, he was about to find out. The city streets hummed with life as Shaq and Elijah walked side by side. Shaq had slowed his long strides to match the boy's shorter steps, but Elijah still seemed to be in a hurry. His eyes flicked nervously from side to side, his small hands shoved deep into the oversized hoodie that nearly swallowed his frame. Shaq had spent years reading people. It wasn't just a skill, it was survival. On the court, off the court, body language told you more than words ever could. And right now, everything about Elijah's posture screamed discomfort, not just the kind that came from shyness, but the kind that hinted at something heavier. "You and your mom live around here?" Shaq asked, keeping his tone casual. Elijah nodded quickly. "Yeah, not far." The words came out clipped, rehearsed. Shaq noted how the boy didn't offer any extra details, as if afraid to say too much. Shaq glanced down at the boy's sneakers. They were 2 sizes too big, the laces knotted in places where they had snapped. His backpack was slung over one shoulder, the strap hanging by a thread, as if it had been stitched and restitched too many times. The fabric was worn, the zipper barely holding together. And then Shaq saw it, a faint yellowing bruise just above Elijah's wrist. His stomach tightened. "You got any brothers or sisters?" Shaq asked, keeping his voice steady. Elijah hesitated. "Number just me and my mom." Shaq could tell he wasn't lying, but there was something in the way he answered. Quick, dismissive, like he didn't want to talk about it. "You help take care of her?" Shaq pressed gently. Elijah nodded, his fingers tightening around the strap of his backpack. "Yeah, she doesn't like to ask for help." Shaq exhaled through his nose, glancing at the pharmacy ahead. It wasn't far now, but something inside him told him he needed to slow down. "That why you didn't want to take the 20 earlier?" Shaq asked. "Didn't want to take more than you needed?" Elijah shrugged, kicking a loose piece of gravel down the sidewalk. "She'd get mad if I did." Shaq frowned. "Mad? Why?" Elijah hesitated again, his shoulders tensing. It was subtle, but Shaq caught it. "She just doesn't like charity," Elijah muttered. "Says people always expect something in return." Shaq let those words sit for a moment. That wasn't something an 8-year-old should have to think about. They reached a crosswalk, and as they waited for the light to change, Shaq glanced down again at Elijah's wrist. The bruise was old, but noticeable. "You fall or something?" Shaq asked, nodding toward it. Elijah quickly pulled his sleeve down, stuffing his hands into his hoodie pocket. Yeah, I trip a lot. It was too quick, too practiced. Shaq felt a familiar weight settle in his chest. He had seen this before, kids making excuses for things that weren't their fault. He had grown up around kids like Elijah, kids who carried burdens that weren't theirs to carry, kids who learned too early how to survive in a world that wasn't fair to them. The light turned green, and they crossed. You play ball? Shaq asked, switching gears. He needed to ease the boy's guard down. Elijah looked up, caught off guard by the question. Sometimes. Shaq grinned. Yeah? You any good? Elijah smirked, just barely. Better than you. Shaq let out a deep, hearty laugh. Oh, you got jokes now, huh? Elijah's shoulders relaxed, just a little. It was the first time Shaq saw a glimpse of something other than worry in his eyes. But as they neared the pharmacy, that worry crept back in. Elijah's pace slowed, his feet dragging. He was stalling now, hesitant to reach their destination. Shaq stopped in front of the glass doors and looked down at him. You coming in? Elijah shifted on his feet. I think I should go back home. She might need me. Shaq studied him for a long moment. You sure about that? Elijah nodded, too fast. Yeah. Shaq wasn't convinced. Tell you what, Shaq said, reaching into his pocket again. Here's a $5. You get what you need, and I'll wait right here. Elijah looked at the bill, then up at Shaq, then back at the bill. His hands twitched at his sides, but he didn't take it. A sinking feeling settled in Shaq's gut. What's wrong? Shaq asked, voice softer now. Elijah's throat bobbed as he swallowed hard. They don't have what she needs here. I have to go somewhere else. Shaq knew a lie when he heard one. His eyes flickered to the glass windows of the pharmacy. Inside, rows of shelves lined with medicine sat in neat aisles. It was a well-stocked place. There was no reason it wouldn't have basic medication. Where do you need to go? Shaq asked carefully. Elijah opened his mouth, then closed it. His jaw tightened. His whole body screamed tension. Shaq bent down, resting his forearms on his knees so he was at eye level with the boy. Elijah, he said gently, you can tell me the truth. For a moment, it looked like Elijah might. His lips parted slightly, his eyes darting around like he was weighing his options. Then, just as quickly, he clamped his mouth shut. I gotta go, he mumbled, stepping back. Shaq straightened, watching as Elijah turned on his heel and started walking away, faster this time, almost breaking into a run. Shaq didn't like it. Didn't like the tension in the boy's shoulders. Didn't like the way he had avoided every direct question. Didn't like the bruises, the hesitation, the way he flinched just a little every time Shaq pushed too close to the truth. Something was wrong. And Shaq wasn't the kind of man to ignore something like that. He exhaled deeply, then made a decision. He wasn't just going to let Elijah walk away. He was going to follow. Shaq watched as Elijah disappeared into the crowd, his small frame weaving through the busy sidewalks with practiced ease. The boy didn't look back, didn't hesitate. He was running, not in a full sprint, but in the way someone does when they don't want to seem like they're running. Shaq adjusted his cap, tugging it lower over his forehead. He wasn't the type to follow kids through the streets, but something about Elijah, the bruises, the hesitation, the way he refused to take more than $5, had latched onto Shaq's gut and refused to let go. This wasn't about a sick mother. Shaq started walking, keeping a few paces behind, blending into the crowd as much as a 7-foot man could. He wasn't exactly inconspicuous, but the city was busy enough that most people barely gave him a second glance. His pace was steady, controlled. He had followed defenders on the court before, watching for weaknesses, studying their movements. This wasn't much different, except now, the stakes weren't a championship. They were something far more important. Elijah turned down a narrow side street, his steps quick and deliberate. The change in scenery was stark. The bright storefronts and lively sidewalks faded behind them, replaced by older buildings with peeling paint, rusted fences, and broken-down cars parked haphazardly along the curbs. Shaq had seen places like this before, Neighborhoods where struggle wasn't just a phase, but a way of life. The kind of place where kids grew up too fast, where people learned to survive on less than what was fair. Elijah glanced over his shoulder once, his eyes darting across the street, scanning, checking. He didn't see Shaq, who had stepped back near a lamppost, pretending to check his phone. The boy continued forward, eventually stopping at a faded brick apartment complex, the kind that had been standing for decades but never properly taken care of. The windows were covered with old curtains, some half open, revealing dimly lit rooms inside. The front door was scratched and dented, the numbers barely hanging onto the wood. Elijah hesitated at the entrance, shifting from foot to foot, before finally pulling the door open and slipping inside. Shaq stayed where he was, watching. Something wasn't right. If Elijah's mother was really sick, why did he look so nervous coming home? Why had he lied about the pharmacy not having the medicine? And why had he acted like he was afraid of being seen? Shaq exhaled, rolling his shoulders. He wasn't about to leave without answers. Looking around, he spotted an old convenience store across the street. It was the kind of place that sold everything from canned goods to cheap cigarettes, where the cashier sat behind a thick glass window. Shaq walked over, stepping inside, the scent of stale bread and motor oil filling the air. An older man sat behind the counter, watching a small TV mounted in the corner, the volume turned down low. He barely looked up as Shaq approached. "Hey man," Shaq said, keeping his voice light. "That apartment across the street. Been there a while?" The man finally looked up, narrowing his eyes. "Yeah. Why?" Shaq shrugged, glancing casually out the window. "Just wondering. Got a friend living there?" The man snorted. "Ain't nobody got friends in that building, just problems." Shaq's jaw tightened. "That right? Been that way for years?" The man continued, leaning back in his chair. "Place is bad news. Cops come by, but not enough. Got folks in there you don't want to mess with." Shaq nodded slowly. "You know a kid named Elijah? Lives there with his mom?" The man frowned, rubbing his chin. "Little guy? Quiet? Always wearing that big hoodie?" Shaq nodded. "Yeah, I seen him," the man said. "Comes in sometimes, buys a candy bar, but never says much. That kid don't act like other kids." Shaq felt that same weight settle in his chest. "What do you mean?" The man sighed, glancing toward the door as if checking for eavesdroppers. "I mean, he walks like he's scared of his own shadow. Like he's always watching his back. I seen kids like that before." He shook his head. "That boy's got trouble following him." Shaq didn't like the sound of that. He turned back toward the apartment, his mind racing. If Elijah was in trouble, real trouble, what was Shaq supposed to do? He couldn't just barge in there and start asking questions. He needed to be smart. So he waited. Minutes passed. The sky dimmed slightly as the sun lowered, stretching shadows across the pavement. A few people trickled in and out of the building, but not Elijah. The longer Shaq stood there, the heavier his instincts screamed at him. Then, movement. Shaq watched as the door creaked open just a sliver. A small figure peered out, glancing left, then right. Elijah. But he wasn't stepping outside. He was just looking, checking. And the look on his face? Fear. Shaq's fists clenched at his sides. Something inside that apartment was keeping Elijah trapped. And Shaq wasn't about to walk away without finding out what it was. Shaq took a slow breath, steadying himself as he stepped across the cracked pavement toward the apartment complex. The air felt different here. Heavier. The smell of damp concrete and old cigarette smoke clung to the air. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barked, but the building itself was eerily quiet, the kind of silence that made Shaq's instincts sharpen. He reached the door Elijah had slipped through earlier. It was worn down, the paint chipped, the number barely clinging to the wood. A deep scratch ran along the edge of the frame, like someone had tried to force their way in once. Shaq lifted a fist and knocked. Nothing. He knocked again, this time more firmly. Footsteps. Soft. Hesitant. A shadow shifted behind the peephole. Whoever was inside didn't open the door right away. Shaq could feel the hesitation, the uncertainty pressing against the wood. Finally, the latch clicked, and the door creaked open just a sliver. A woman stood there, her frame thin, almost fragile. She had dark circles under her eyes, her skin pale, her lips dry and chapped. Her hair, once neatly tied back, had come loose in messy strands around her face. She was young, probably no older than her early 30s, but the weight she carried made her look older. "Can I help you?" Her voice was soft, cautious. Shaq adjusted his stance, making sure he didn't look imposing. "Hey, ma'am. My name's Shaquille. I ran into Elijah earlier. Just wanted to check in." At the mention of Elijah's name, her fingers tightened on the edge of the door. "You shouldn't be here," she whispered. Shaq frowned. "Look, I don't mean any harm, I just—" He hesitated, then lowered his voice. "Your boy asked me for $5 for medicine. I don't think that's the full story." The woman's lips parted slightly, but she didn't speak. Instead, she glanced over her shoulder, deeper into the apartment, as if she were afraid of someone hearing. Then, after a long pause, she sighed and pulled the door open just enough for him to step inside. Shaq ducked slightly as he entered, his broad shoulders nearly brushing the doorframe. Inside, the air was thick, stale. The apartment was small, too small. The living room barely had any furniture. A stained couch sat pushed against the wall, its cushions sunken in. A thin, patchy blanket lay crumpled in the corner, and next to it, a small, old mattress on the floor. The walls were bare except for a single clock, its hands stuck at the wrong time. Shaq's eyes swept over the space, taking in every detail. Expired medicine bottles sat on a wobbly table, their labels faded. A single grocery bag rested on the counter, holding only a loaf of bread and a half-empty bottle of water. And then, there was Elijah. The boy stood near the edge of the room, his arms crossed over his chest, eyes darting between Shaq and his mother. He looked tense, like he was waiting for something bad to happen. Shaq turned to the woman. "You okay?" She let out a quiet laugh, one without any real humor. "That depends on what you mean by okay." Shaq didn't push. Instead, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a few folded bills. "Here," he said, offering them to her. "This should help a little." But the woman didn't take it. Her hands stayed at her sides, clenched into small fists. "I can't," she said. Shaq tilted his head. "Why not?" She hesitated, her gaze flickering toward the front door again. It was small, but Shaq caught it. She was scared, not of him, but of something, or someone else. Elijah shifted uncomfortably. "Mom, it's okay," he whispered. But she shook her head. "No, it's not." Shaq exhaled. He wasn't just dealing with a struggling mother and her son. There was something deeper here, something unspoken. "You don't have to tell me everything," Shaq said carefully. "But if something ain't right, you gotta let somebody help." Her eyes finally met his, and for a moment, Shaq saw it. Pure exhaustion. The kind that went beyond physical illness. This was the exhaustion of someone carrying too much. Someone fighting a battle they couldn't win alone. Then, just as quickly, she looked away. "You should go," she said softly. Shaq didn't move. Not yet. A heavy silence filled the room. Elijah bit his lip, shifting from foot to foot. "Mom, he's nice," the boy whispered. Her shoulders tensed. Shaq saw it then, the way she flinched at the word nice. And suddenly, it clicked. This wasn't just about money. This wasn't just about medicine. This was about someone else, someone who wasn't here right now, but who would be coming back. Shaq set the money down on the table, making sure not to press her further. He had to be careful. He didn't want to make things worse. "All right," he finally said. "I hear you. I'll go." The woman let out a quiet breath, relief flashing across her face. But it was mixed with something else. Guilt. Shaq turned to Elijah. "You take care, little man." Elijah gave a small nod, but his eyes held something that made Shaq pause. It wasn't just gratitude. It was pleading. Shaq held the boy's gaze for a long moment before finally stepping toward the door. But as he reached for the handle, a sound stopped him cold. The rattling of a key in the lock. Shaq's jaw tightened. Whoever was about to walk through that door was the reason for all of this. And he wasn't leaving just yet. The key twisted in the lock, the metallic scrape filling the small apartment with a sudden suffocating weight. Shaq didn't move. He felt the air shift, saw the way Elijah shrank back toward the wall, how his mother's fingers clenched at the hem of her shirt. Then the door swung open. A man stepped inside, his frame lean but tense, the kind of wiry strength that came from a life spent surviving rather than thriving. His face was sharp, with hollowed-out cheeks and eyes that flickered with something dark, something possessive. His clothes were worn, but not in the way Elijah's were. His jacket was clean, his boots solid. He wasn't struggling. He was just mean. The moment his gaze landed on Shaq, his entire body stiffened, his jaw clenched, and his grip tightened on the set of keys dangling from his fingers. "The hell is this?" the man muttered, his voice low, sharp. Shaq didn't respond immediately. Instead, he took in every detail, the way the man's nostrils flared, the way his knuckles whitened as his fingers curled into his palm. He wasn't just surprised, he was calculating. Elijah's mother stepped forward, her movements careful, like someone walking on glass. "He was just leaving," she said quickly, her voice light, almost too casual. I ran into him earlier. He just wanted to help." The man's eyes didn't leave Shaq. "Help," he echoed, his tone mocking, twisted with something bitter. "Yeah? That what you do, big guy? Go around helping people?" Shaq exhaled slowly, keeping his stance relaxed but firm. "Yeah," he said. "That's what I do." The man took a step inside, closing the door behind him with a slow, deliberate push. The sound of the latch clicking into place sent a ripple of unease through the room. Shaq wasn't scared, but he knew a dangerous man when he saw one. And this man wasn't dangerous in the way people thought he was. Shaq had been called intimidating his whole life, on the court, in the media, by people who had never even met him. But real intimidation? Real danger? That came from men like this. Men who controlled with silence, with subtle threats. Men who didn't need to throw a punch to make their victims bleed. The mother stepped closer to her son, her hand hovering protectively near his shoulder. Elijah didn't say a word, his small frame rigid. He was used to this. That made Shaq's stomach turn. The man tilted his head, looking Shaq up and down. "Funny, don't think I've seen you around here before." Shaq met his gaze, unflinching. "Just passing through." The man let out a low chuckle, but there was no humor in it. "That right?" Shaq didn't answer. He just held the silence, let it stretch between them. He had learned a long time ago that sometimes the best way to handle a man like this was to give him nothing. No reaction, no fear, just presence. But even without speaking, Shaq had already made a mistake. He had come in. And now the stepfather saw him as a threat. The man took another step forward, his eyes narrowing. "You given my woman money?" Shaq's jaw tightened. "I was helping Elijah. That a problem?" A flicker of something dark passed through the man's expression. His lips curled slightly, the barest hint of a smirk. "Oh, I get it. You see some sad little story, and you think you can just waltz in here and play hero?" The way he said hero made Shaq's skin crawl. The man turned slightly, his gaze shifting toward Elijah's mother, who had gone completely still. "Told you before," he muttered. "We don't need nobody sticking their nose where it don't belong." Elijah's mother nodded quickly. "I know. He was just leaving." Shaq didn't move. The man turned back to him. "You deaf?" Shaq exhaled through his nose. He had two choices. He could walk away, pretend he didn't see what was happening here. Or he could push just a little harder, see how deep this hole really went. He looked at Elijah. The kid hadn't moved, hadn't even blinked. Shaq turned back to the man. "You care about this kid?" he asked, his voice even. The man's smirk disappeared. "Excuse me?" Shaq kept his gaze steady. "If you cared, you'd make sure he didn't have to beg strangers for $5 just to get his mom medicine." The tension in the room spiked. The man's nostrils flared, but Shaq could see the hesitation behind his anger. He wasn't used to being challenged. Not like this. Shaq took a step forward, closing the space between them just enough. "You don't scare me," he said, his voice calm. "But I think you scare them." The man stiffened. Elijah's mother inhaled sharply. "Please," she whispered. The man's head snapped toward her, and for the first time his mask slipped. His eyes darkened, his mouth twitching. It was only for a second, but it was enough. Shaq had his answer. This wasn't just about money. This wasn't just about poverty. This was control. The man turned back to Shaq, straightening his shoulders. "You don't know a damn thing about what goes on in this house," he said, his voice low. Shaq tilted his head. "I know enough." The man's fists twitched at his sides, but he didn't swing. He wouldn't. Not now, not in front of Shaq. But Shaq knew what would happen when he left. Knew that once the door shut, things would go back to the way they were. And he couldn't let that happen. He glanced at Elijah's mother. "You want this to keep going?" he asked. Her lips parted, but no words came out. Shaq softened his voice. "I can help, but you gotta let me." The man let out a sharp laugh. "Help? Ain't nobody here needs your damn help." But his voice cracked, just a little. Shaq looked at Elijah. "You want to stay here?" Elijah hesitated. It was only for a second, but it was enough. The man saw it too. His expression darkened. And that's when Shaq knew he wasn't walking away from this. Not yet. He had stepped into something bigger than he had realized, and now he had to figure out how to get them out of it. Shaq had been in tense situations before. On the court, he had faced some of the toughest opponents, stared down rivals who wanted nothing more than to see him break. But this was different. This wasn't a game. This was real. And the stakes weren't a championship ring. This was about a boy who was silently begging for help without saying a word. Elijah hadn't moved. He was standing near the corner of the room, his small hands gripping the strap of his worn-out backpack like it was the only thing anchoring him. His eyes flickered between Shaq and the man standing in front of him. Fear wasn't just in his eyes. It was in the way he stood, the way he held his breath, waiting for something. Shaq could feel it now, the weight pressing against his chest. If he walked out of that door, nothing would change. The boy would go back to living in fear. His mother would go back to pretending things were fine. And that man, the stepfather, would go back to controlling them like he always had. That wasn't happening. Shaq exhaled slowly, then reached into his pocket, pulling out a thick fold of cash. He saw the stepfather's eyes shift the moment the money appeared. "You're right," Shaq said, keeping his voice even. "I don't know what goes on in this house, and it ain't my business." The stepfather relaxed slightly, smirking like he had won something. "But," Shaq continued, thumbing through the bills, "I do know what it's like to struggle. I know what it's like to feel like the whole world is stacked against you." He let the money show just enough to catch the man's full attention. "So, if money is the issue, I can help." The room went still. Elijah's mother inhaled sharply, eyes widening. The stepfather tilted his head. "Help?" Shaq nodded. "Yeah, help." He extended the cash. "Take it. No strings, just making sure the kid and his mom got what they need." The man stared at the money, then at Shaq. His lips twitched. Shaq could see the battle happening behind his eyes. Taking money from a stranger meant admitting he didn't have control over everything. But greed was a powerful thing. Finally, the man snatched the cash from Shaq's hand. Shaq watched closely. The stepfather didn't even look at Elijah, didn't even glance at the mother. His fingers tightened around the bills, his thumb flipping through them quickly, counting. His entire focus was on the money, not on his family, not on what they needed. And that was all Shaq needed to see. This man didn't care about Elijah. He didn't care about the woman standing behind him, holding her breath, her shoulders hunched as if waiting for a storm to hit. He only cared about himself. Shaq turned slightly, catching Elijah's mother's gaze. He didn't speak, didn't move too fast. He just looked at her, held her stare, and she understood. Her lips parted slightly, her eyes glassy. She had spent so long feeling invisible, so long thinking no one noticed, no one cared. But now, someone saw, someone knew. For the first time in a long time, she wasn't alone. The stepfather, still fixated on the money, chuckled. "Guess you're not as dumb as you look, big guy. You see a problem, you throw cash at it. Smart man." Shaq smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. Yeah, smart. Then he glanced at Elijah. The boy hadn't moved, hadn't spoken, but there was something different in his eyes now. A flicker of something small, something fragile. Hope. Shaq wasn't done here. Not yet. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. Shaq sat in his car, gripping the steering wheel, his mind racing. The cash had been taken. The stepfather thought he had won. But Shaq knew better. He had played this game long enough to know the real move wasn't throwing money at a problem. It was knowing when to step in before things spiraled beyond repair. And this was a problem that needed fixing. Elijah and his mother were trapped. Not just in poverty, but in something far worse. Invisible chains of fear, control, and silence. Shaq had seen it before. He had met kids like Elijah growing up, kids who carried burdens that weren't theirs to carry. And if Shaq walked away now, that boy would still be standing in that corner tomorrow, eyes hollow, waiting for someone else to notice. Except no one else would. Shaq exhaled, his decision made. He pulled out his phone and dialed. Yo, a deep voice answered on the other end. Need a favor, Shaq said, keeping his voice low. Big man, it's late. Not for this. The person on the other end didn't ask questions. They just listened. Shaq explained the situation in careful words, making sure not to say too much over the phone. But the urgency in his voice was clear. I got you, the voice finally said. Give me an hour. Shaq nodded and hung up. One step down. Now he had to get Elijah and his mom out without setting off alarms. Shaq knew he couldn't just walk back into that apartment and tell them to leave. The stepfather wasn't stupid. He'd smell an escape attempt a mile away. And if he even suspected something was off, he'd tighten his grip. Shaq needed a distraction. He walked back toward the apartment complex, taking the stairs 2 at a time. When he reached their door, he knocked lightly. The hesitation on the other side was immediate. Then the door cracked open just an inch. Elijah's mother looked up at him, fear still laced in her eyes. She glanced over her shoulder, checking if the man was nearby. Shaq leaned in slightly, lowering his voice. You trust me? She didn't answer at first, but then, after a moment, she gave the smallest nod. Good, Shaq said. Pack a bag for you and Elijah. Nothing big, just essentials. Her breath hitched. I can't. Yes, you can, Shaq said gently. You have to. She swallowed hard, her fingers gripping the doorframe. He won't let us. Shaq's expression hardened. He's not gonna know. Another glance over her shoulder. She was weighing the risk, the consequences. But Shaq could see something shift in her eyes. The first spark of someone who had been told for too long that escape wasn't an option. Suddenly realizing it was. Finally, she nodded. Shaq straightened. 10 minutes, he murmured. Be ready. She shut the door without another word. Shaq needed to buy them time. He pulled out his phone and made one more call. Need you to get someone talking for a while, he said. How long? 10 minutes. Done. Shaq hung up and moved down the hallway, waiting. Less than 5 minutes later, a loud knock echoed through the apartment complex. Shaq heard a voice, someone outside calling the stepfather's name. It was the building manager. The timing was perfect. From the shadows, Shaq watched as the stepfather swung the door open, already irritated. What do you want? Rent's late again, the manager said, stepping forward. We need to talk. Shaq didn't stick around to listen. He knew the argument would last at least 10 minutes. That was enough. He slipped back toward Elijah's door and knocked softly. It opened almost instantly. Elijah's mother stood there, a small duffel bag slung over her shoulder. Elijah clutched his backpack tightly, his face tense but determined. Shaq didn't waste time. Let's go. The 3 of them moved quickly, keeping to the stairwell instead of the elevator. Every footstep echoed louder than Shaq liked, but no one stopped them. When they reached the street, Shaq led them toward his car. The moment Elijah climbed in, Shaq saw the tension in the boy's shoulders loosen just a fraction. Elijah's mother hesitated before getting inside. She turned to Shaq, her eyes filled with unspoken words. What if he comes after us? She whispered. Shaq met her gaze. He won't. She searched his face, trying to decide if she believed him. Then slowly, she nodded and got in. Shaq shut the door behind her, checked the street one last time, then slid into the driver's seat. As he pulled away from the curb, Shaq glanced at Elijah in the rearview mirror. "You good?" Elijah nodded, but his hands were still gripping the straps of his backpack, as if afraid to let go. "You hungry?" Shaq asked. Elijah hesitated, then nodded again. Shaq smirked. "All right, let's get some food first." A small, hesitant smile flickered across Elijah's face. It wasn't much, but it was a start. Shaq didn't just take them to get food. He took them somewhere safe, somewhere the stepfather wouldn't find them. He made another call, setting up a place for them to stay, a private, quiet location where no one would ask questions. And the next morning, he made sure Elijah's mother got the medical care she needed. She was still scared, still unsure. But for the first time, she wasn't alone. And Elijah, the boy who had once stood in a corner, afraid to speak, afraid to hope, he was finally in a place where he didn't have to be afraid anymore. Shaq knew the system didn't always work. He knew too many people slipped through the cracks. That's why he didn't just drop them off and walk away. He made sure they had everything they needed: food, clothes, safety. He got in touch with the right people, made sure paperwork was filed, made sure the stepfather wouldn't come looking. And even after they were settled, he checked in. Because this wasn't just about saving them for one night. It was about making sure they never had to go back. Shaq had given them more than just a way out. He had given them a future, and Shaq didn't need fists to win. The morning after the escape, Shaq sat in a quiet corner of a small private office. Elijah's mother sat across from him, clutching a cup of coffee she hadn't touched. Her hands trembled slightly, not from the cold, but from years of being conditioned to believe help wasn't real. Beside her, Elijah sat stiffly, his backpack still strapped to his shoulders like a lifeline. He was safe, but he didn't believe it yet. Shaq turned toward the man sitting next to him. Marcus Reynolds, an old friend who had traded a basketball jersey for a badge years ago. Marcus was sharp, direct, and one of the few people Shaq trusted completely. "So you're telling me this guy's been controlling them for years?" Marcus asked, flipping through the file Shaq had given him. Shaq nodded. "Threats. Manipulation. Probably worse." Marcus exhaled through his nose. "And you got them out?" Shaq's jaw tightened. "Yeah, but that's not enough." Marcus glanced at Elijah's mother. She lowered her gaze, fingers tightening around the cup. She had agreed to be here, but she was still scared. Shaq could feel it. Marcus leaned forward. "Ma'am, I know you don't trust the system. I get it. But if we're gonna make sure he doesn't come after you, we need to act now." She hesitated. "He has people." Her voice was small, fragile. "He always said no one would believe me, that even if I left, he'd find me." Shaq's stomach twisted. Marcus's eyes hardened. "Let me be clear. He doesn't have the kind of people that I have." He tapped the file. "I can make sure you're protected, but I need something to work with." Silence filled the room. Shaq knew what she was thinking. Every decision she had ever made was based on survival. Running was one thing. But standing up? That was another fight entirely. Elijah shifted beside her. His small voice broke the silence. "He's never gonna stop, is he?" Shaq turned to him, something heavy settling in his chest. The boy had spent years watching his mother suffer, watching his own life shrink to the size of a single apartment where fear controlled every breath. But now he was realizing that unless something changed, his past would follow him. Elijah's mother swallowed hard. Then slowly she nodded. What do I have to do?" Shaq exhaled. This was it. The first real step toward ending this for good. For the next hour, Marcus guided her through the process. How to file a formal complaint, how to document everything. Shaq sat beside Elijah, keeping one eye on the boy as his mother recalled years of silent suffering. The bruises, the threats, the nights she lay awake, listening for his footsteps, the fear of saying the wrong thing, of setting him off. Elijah kept his gaze on the floor, his hands gripping his backpack straps tightly. Shaq didn't say much. He just sat there, letting the boy know he wasn't alone. When it was done, Marcus stood. "This isn't just a case of emotional abuse," he said, voice sharp. "This is a case of coercion, intimidation. We'll file for an emergency restraining order first. That'll buy us time while we build a full case." Elijah's mother looked at him wary. "And if he ignores it?" Marcus's expression was stone. "Then we make sure he regrets it." Shaq nodded. He knew Marcus wasn't just talking about paperwork. While Marcus handled the legal side, Shaq made another call. This time, to someone with influence. News traveled fast in certain circles, and Shaq knew the right people to nudge the story in the direction it needed to go. He wasn't about to let this man walk away without consequence. By that evening, the stepfather's name was circulating. Small mentions, whispers in the right places. The kind of whispers that turned into consequences. People like him thrived in the dark. Shaq was dragging him into the light. 2 days later, Shaq sat on the back porch of the small, safe house where he had set up Elijah and his mother. The air was still, the city lights flickering in the distance. Elijah sat beside him, legs swinging off the edge of the steps. "Is he gonna go to jail?" the boy finally asked. Shaq sighed. "We're working on it." Elijah nodded, but Shaq could tell that wasn't what he really wanted to ask. After a long pause, the boy looked up at him. "Are we gonna have to run forever?" Shaq turned, meeting the boy's gaze. "No," he said firmly. "You're not running anymore." Elijah searched his face, as if trying to decide whether to believe him. Shaq rested a massive hand on the boy's shoulder. "Listen to me, little man. That guy, he doesn't get to control your life anymore. You hear me?" Elijah hesitated. Then, for the first time, he nodded. Not just a small, uncertain nod, but a real one. Shaq gave his shoulder a light squeeze. "You got a future now. A real one. And you get to decide what it looks like." Elijah was quiet for a long time. Then slowly, a small smile tugged at his lips. Shaq had seen a lot of things in his life. Won championships, met legends, traveled the world. But that small, quiet smile, that was worth more than any trophy he had ever held. The morning air was crisp, the sky a shade of soft blue that promised a new beginning. The past few days had been a whirlwind, a quiet battle fought without fists, but with strategy, influence, and most of all, compassion. Shaq had done what he came to do. He had pulled Elijah and his mother out of the darkness they were trapped in. Now, it was time for them to start over. They were safe now, staying in a small but comfortable home that Shaq's people had arranged. It wasn't much yet, just a clean space with new clothes, fresh groceries, and a sense of peace they hadn't known in years. It was temporary, but for the first time, they had options. Shaq parked outside and took a deep breath before stepping out. He had been checking in every day, making sure things were running smoothly. He had seen transformations before, rookie players finding their confidence, teammates overcoming obstacles. But this one was different. This wasn't about sports. This was about survival. When he knocked, it was Elijah who opened the door. The boy looked different. There was still caution in his eyes, but it wasn't the same deep-seated fear from before. His shoulders weren't as hunched, and for the first time, he wasn't gripping that old backpack like it was the only thing holding him together. "Hey, big man," Shaq said, flashing a small grin. "You good?" Elijah hesitated, then nodded. "Yeah." Shaq stepped inside, greeted by the sight of Elijah's mother in the small kitchen. She looked healthier, the exhaustion still present but no longer crushing her. She turned with a grateful smile. "You didn't have to come by," she said. Shaq shrugged. "Yeah, I did." Elijah climbed onto the couch, kicking his legs slightly, his body more at ease than Shaq had ever seen. There was something about the way he looked at Shaq now. Trust. Not the guarded kind, the real kind. They sat together in comfortable silence for a moment. Then Elijah dug into his pocket and pulled out a small folded piece of paper. He held it out. "Here." Shaq raised an eyebrow. "What's this?" Elijah shrugged, avoiding eye contact. "Just take it." Shaq unfolded the paper slowly. It was a drawing. A simple one, drawn with an old pen. Elijah's best attempt at sketching Shaq, standing next to a much smaller stick figure labeled me. Above them, In shaky handwriting were the words, "Thank you for seeing me." Shaq swallowed hard, his throat tight. He had been gifted trophies, championship rings, awards. But this hit different. He nodded, folding the paper carefully. "You know," he said, "I'm keeping this forever, right?" Elijah's lips twitched into a small, rare smile. Shaq patted his shoulder. "You're gonna be all right, kid." For the first time, Shaq could see that Elijah believed it too. A little while later, Shaq stood outside the door again, hands in his pockets. "You sure you don't want us to call you if—" Elijah's mother started. Shaq held up a hand. "You call if you need anything, but you got this. Both of you." She nodded, wiping at the corner of her eye. "I don't know how to thank you." Shaq smiled. "You already did." He turned, walking toward his car. It had started with $5. That was all Elijah had asked for, $5 for his sick mother. But Shaq hadn't just given him $5. He had given him a future. And that was worth more than anything. Not every cry for help is loud. Some are hidden in silence, in a child's eyes, in a story left unfinished. Shaq didn't walk away, and neither should we. There are Elijahs everywhere, waiting to be seen. Stay aware. Stay involved. Because sometimes, changing a life starts with just $5, or simply paying attention. What would you do if someone needed you today?